Hello, and welcome to our lecture on non-experimental research, Chapter 7. When we look at types of non-experimental designs, we have three main types. We have single variable research, single variable research is a type of non-experimental research where you only look at the effect of one variable. What we've been talking about up until this point is mainly experimental research, which is looking at the connection between two variables of interest. Single variable research looks at the effect of one factor and one factor alone. So for example, if we wanted to investigate why people chose the college they did, we would be investigating one variable, right? Why did you choose the college you did? A second type of non-experimental research is correlational research. Correlational research is when you look at the relationship between two variables of interest. So for example, you could look at the relationship between exposure to sunlight and symptomology of depression. What you're doing here is you're just seeing, is there a relationship between how much light people get and how often they experience symptoms of depression? You're not actually investigating a causal connection between being exposed to a certain amount of light and having a certain number of symptoms. You're just seeing if more people experience more light, do they have less symptoms? And conversely, if people have less light exposure, do they have more depressive symptoms? The third type of non-experimental research is called quasi-experimental research. And quasi-experimental research is very similar to experimental research in that there is some sort of manipulation of an independent variable, and we're looking to see if there's an effect on a dependent variable. However, it may be impossible for you to randomly assign participants to groups as part of that independent variable. So for example, if you were to look at the effect of gender on caretaking abilities, you would not actually be able to randomly assign people to being male or female. It's a participant characteristic, right? You cannot manipulate it. But you still may be interested in seeing what causal differences exist here. And so what you would do is you would just run a quasi-experimental research where we look at the effect of gender on caretaking behaviors, but we just lack the ability to randomly assign participants to groups. When you choose a non-experimental design, one of the things that you need to be aware of is the lack of internal validity that some of these design types have. An experiment, which is looking at causal changes between the independent variable and a dependent variable, have very high internal validity. Quasi-experimental research studies, where you are unable to manipulate your independent variable randomly, but you are still looking at the effect of that independent variable on a dependent variable, have less internal validity than a true experiment, but they still have some ability to assess causal differences. Whereas correlational research studies have even less internal validity. We are not sure if a change in one variable is responsible solely for the change in the second variable. There could be a third variable that is causing both variables to change. So because of that, it has less internal validity. When you have a non-experimental design, you have some additional ways that you can gather the data for this type of design. One of the ways you can gather data for a non-experimental design is through a process called naturalistic observation. And naturalistic observation is where you actually go out and observe participants and see how they behave in the real world. By engaging in naturalistic observation, you're trying to answer real-world research questions by observing the behavior in the real world. Why you may want to do this is because laboratory settings, while they're tightly controlled and give us a lot of internal validity, they sometimes are artificial. They lack the external validity that we sometimes seek. Also, naturalistic observation gives us a better idea of what variables are actually affecting people's behaviors. In naturalistic observation, a researcher observes what variables are present, whereas in a laboratory setting, you have to set up the variables that are present. So naturalistic observation can allow researchers to have new insights into phenomena. An example of naturalistic observation could be perhaps going to the main student quad and just sitting down and seeing how do people interact with one another? Do people sit in dyads? Do people sit, 4 people to a table? How do students interact with one another? And just simply by sitting there and maybe taking a tally count, or just by observing the relationships people have in the student quad, you would have a better sense of how students interact with one another. Another method for gathering data could be using an archival source of data. And an archival source of data is data that is reported by some other individual for some other purpose. Data sets that are commonly utilized in archival data are public health data and census data. This is data that the government captures and that researchers have access to because it is paid for by our taxes. One example of an archival source of data that you could use is the General Social Survey. That is available, and it's an online archival source that researchers have access to. It shows you information like this. You have the database once you've requested access to it, and you can search for topics. You can view for all studies, you can browse by topic, browse by geographical area, browse by a favorite investigator. Once you've selected some sort of topic that you're interested in, you'll get an explanation of what that study is, and you'll have a sense of what the title was, who conducted it, who funded the research. It also tells you a summary of what was done so that you have a sense of, is this data set an appropriate data set for me to utilize in order to answer the research question of interest? If the research summary doesn't sound quite like what you need, but sounds close, you can look up subject terms in order to find other studies that may be more appropriate for you to utilize. So now I hope you are a little bit more comfortable with the 3 main types of non-experimental research, and also some of the methods we utilize in order to gather data for non-experimental research.